Hello there, Homeschool Nolan here to help you navigate learning in the digital age. Today I'm recording this over President's Day weekend, a weekend known for mattress sales as well as for celebrating our nation's past presidents. And today I'd like to talk to you about why two presidents, George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, still matter. Now, if you're a parent who grew up in my generation, you may find this title a bit odd. After all, you probably grew up as I did, learning that Washington and Lincoln were our nation's two greatest presidents. One founded the nation, and the other saved it. But times change. Recently, the San Francisco Board of Education voted to take down the names of schools named after Washington and Lincoln. Surely, the standards by which we judge historical figures can change with the times. So today, I'd like to share with you why I believe that teaching young people about the lives of these two presidents, George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, matter more than ever now. Let's start with George Washington. George Washington is commonly remembered as the father of our country. Before becoming the nation's first president, he was the general who led the Revolutionary War against the British Empire. Now, to fully appreciate George Washington now in the 21st century, you need to first look at the world he lived in back in the 18th century. You see, throughout human history, people have always been ruled by emperors, kings, and pharaohs. Yes, there were attempts at democratic forms of government like in ancient Greece, but none of them ever lasted very long. Indeed, throughout human history, people of all nations and all colors have almost always been under the rule of a king, an emperor, or a Caesar. These rulers ruled with absolute authority and often claimed to be gods with a divine right to rule for as long as they lived on this earth. Now, George Washington, if he wanted to, he could have been king himself. At the very least, he could have been president for life. He was a leader of such immense stature and respect that many Americans at the time actually wanted him to be king. But George Washington, as our first president, chose to step away after two terms as president. This was completely unprecedented for the times. But by doing so, George Washington set the precedent for future presidents, and he demonstrated that the peaceful transition of power in a democracy was possible, and that the American Revolution was truly unique. Now, other countries have had revolutions too. During Washington's first term as president, there was the French Revolution in 1789. But unlike the American Revolution, the French Revolution did not lead to liberty. Instead, it led to the guillotine, the Reign of Terror, and eventually the rise of a new military dictator named Napoleon Bonaparte. And later, in the 20th century, both China and Russia also had major revolutions. But both these revolutions led to the rise of totalitarian communist states. The reason these other revolutions did not lead to liberty is because they did not have the good fortune of being led by men such as George Washington, who, unlike say Lenin or Mao Zedong, did not wish to be a supreme leader for life. George Washington, like his fellow founding fathers, believed in the principles of self-government, where governments derive their power from the consent of the governed rather than the other way around. It is for this reason why the life of George Washington still matters more than ever now, and why his life should be taught and remembered by all young people growing up in America today. Now, George Washington was by no means perfect, especially by today's standards. He was born in 1732 in Virginia into a world that embraced slavery. Washington himself was a slave owner most of his entire life, most of whom he either inherited or gained through the marriage to his wife Martha. And although he espoused the principles of self-government and liberty, Washington never made any serious effort to grant freedom to his own slaves during his lifetime. It is for this reason that some people today don't feel he's worthy of being remembered as a hero. In fact, it was this glaring contradiction and hypocrisy with regards to slavery that kept the young United States divided in the beginning. From the beginning, about half the country always opposed slavery, while about half always defended it. And strangely though, both sides of the slavery issue, however, read the same Bible and believed they were still following the principles laid out in the Declaration of Independence. It was this deep division that eventually culminated in the American Civil War. And this leads us to Abraham Lincoln, whom most historians regard as the greatest president in American history. Abraham Lincoln is commonly remembered as the president who saved the Union and freed the slaves during the Civil War. Now, civil wars, like revolutions, are not unique to American history. But the American Civil War was unique in that it was a war fought to preserve a nation that was, as Lincoln put it, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Rather than let the southern slave-holding states secede from the Union, Lincoln was determined to save the United States through the most difficult and bloodiest time in its history. Through 4 long, bloody years of civil war, he persevered in preserving what he called the last best hope and ensuring that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. And to fully appreciate why Lincoln still matters today, you must first imagine what the world might have become had he failed. Had Lincoln not succeeded in saving the Union, the United States would have disintegrated and slavery would have continued in America. America's experiment in self-government, based on the proposition that all men are created equal, would have failed. And it would have also set the precedent that any state who didn't like the results of an election could simply secede and leave the Union. And imagine how the entire history of the world would have been different if Lincoln had not succeeded. If the United States had fallen apart in the 19th century, there would have been no United States in the 20th century to help defeat Nazism and fascism in World War II. And those of us Americans, like myself, who are either immigrants or descendants of immigrants, most likely would not even be living in the United States today. So that's why both Washington and Lincoln still matter today. Every child growing up in America is living in an America that would not exist were it not for George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. One founded the United States and the other preserved it. Had either man not lived, we would all be living in a very different country and world today. And with that, it's up to each generation to teach the next generation the history of our country. But teaching history, in my opinion, can be very hard to do well. The reason for that is that we are all human and we all can have our own interpretation of history. There's always the temptation to emphasize only our narrative and dismiss other viewpoints that don't fit our own narrative. There's also the growing trend today to judge past historical figures based on the morality of today. But remember, every single person is a product of their times. How many of us living today can be sure that we would pass the morality test of people living 100 years from now? In my opinion, historical figures should be judged not against the standards of today, but by how they lived in their times and shaped the world we are living in today. And by this measure, both George Washington and Abraham Lincoln matter more than ever. The teaching of history from one generation to the next is an important responsibility. And I hope this has been helpful as you help your children and your students understand the past so they can better prepare for the future. If you found this video helpful, please click subscribe in the button below. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.